Okay, so the next component of your teaching portfolio is the teaching statement. And this is something that I work with graduate students all year long, going over teaching statements with. It's a very funny genre because it's not like any other kind of writing that we have to do as academic professionals. It's much more personal than a research statement is, and it is much more narrative than any of our research writing, and yet it's still a professional document, right? A teaching statement really serves as a reduction, so to speak, of everything that's in your teaching portfolio. So the story that your teaching statement tells should be the same story as what the story your overall portfolio tells. And so that's why I've included these questions, and they may strike you as familiar to the questions that I said at the beginning your whole portfolio should answer, right? So why do you teach the way that you do? What are your goals for student learning, right? What specific things do you do to implement your beliefs about teaching? How do you enact those goals? What teaching methods do you use? How do you use them? Why do you use them? How do you take into account students' needs or capabilities and experiences into your teaching? How do your teaching techniques or approaches help your students learn? So how do you know they're getting anything out of this? How do you assess students' achievements of those learning goals? And then describe any steps you have taken to further your development as a teacher, right? So ideally, a teaching statement will address, at least in part, many of these questions. That same, like I said at the beginning, that same arc. What's your goal? What do you use to meet that goal? And how do you know you've hit it? All right. So in addition to this, what else should a teaching statement be? Well, teaching statement is going to be 1 to 2 pages, single-spaced. A teaching statement is an opportunity for reviewers to really see you in the classroom. So that's why I've got my oil pellet picture there to inspire you to be very visual in your language. This is an opportunity for you to really distinguish yourself. So you want a teaching statement to be memorable and distinctive. And many people choose to do this in an opening paragraph that tells an anecdote, but you certainly don't have to. What the best teaching statements do is to tell an individual story, right? And so that's why I have here as this bullet, own your philosophy, tell your story. What that also means is to really keep the emphasis on me and I as the pronouns, right? So rather than say, all great teachers do, or the best teachers do, right? The following things, really say, I do this thing. I choose this technique, because that's both that sort of owning it, right? Not deflecting and saying, well, I do this because it's a good thing to do, but rather saying, I do this thing because this is what I value as a teacher. So showing that ownership. But it also saves you from the trap of describing a teaching technique that is very effective for you and your discipline in your classroom, and saying in your statement, oh, all good teachers do this, or no good teacher would ever X, Y, and Z, because without fail, if you make a sweeping statement like that, somebody who is reading your application will do exactly that thing that you say one should never do. And that is an instant negative response from that committee member. So if you just talk about, I do this thing, and leave it there, you're not potentially distancing yourself from your committee readers. So do write in the first person. And write in the present tense. So if you are trying to show some change, right, and say, well, I tried doing this thing once in the past, and then I learned that I should do something different, and now I do X, Y, and Z, then it's appropriate to use the past tense. But for the most part, talk about as you teach now, right? This good thing that you do, this value that you hold it now, you have held it in the past, you will hold it in the future. And because of that, just use the present tense. So when I teach, I choose active learning strategies, right? Keep it in the present. And then use technical terms sparingly if you use them at all. So this is also where we come back to the selection committee is from across the university, right? So if you are describing in very technical terms a particularly challenging concept, let's say, in your field, and so for somebody in your field, you may introduce that in the technical jargon and say, well, when I'm introducing this concept of blah, 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 right? And somebody in your field would say, oh, yeah, students, yeah, hard time with that one, right? But it'll benefit your readers if rather than saying just the phrase, the technical phrase, you say, when introducing a threshold concept that many students progressing from introductory to intermediate studies find challenging, I do X, Y, and Z, right? So rather than focusing on the technical language in your field about that concept that students struggle with, just describe it as a concept that students struggle with. And that will make it a lot more accessible to your readers. Similarly, you may know what a particular pedagogical technique is, but rather than like listing it in shorthand, go ahead and describe the technique, what you do, what the students do, what comes out of that process, rather than just dropping in a phrase that you hope is common knowledge. Okay? So, we have, at this point, some commonly asked questions about teaching statements. All right. So, the first question is often, how much time will it take to create this application, to create this whole teaching portfolio? Usually we say it takes about 15 to 20 hours to complete the entire portfolio. That may seem like a lot of time, but, spread out over the next month. It hopefully is not too much. And you can count, some of the hours that you're spending watching these videos towards that time. And it may take you not as long, right? Or it may take you longer, depending on where you're at in your process. But the wonderful thing is, as Dean Wallace mentioned in our introductory video, is that the time you spend working on this portfolio now will be time that you save yourself when you are creating similar application documents in the future for your job portfolio, or to characterize yourself as a teacher in any other context. A second commonly asked question is, am I restricted to including only traditional classroom teaching? So many graduate students say, well, I was the TA, but I only guest lectured once. Or I was the TA, but I was only a grader. Or I led a recitation section, but the faculty member actually did all the lectures, or whatever, right? Those are all teaching experiences that can and should be included as you talk about yourself. Again, in that representative but selective, that's representative of the teaching that you've done. So don't let the fact that you have either never been an instructor of record or only part of your teaching experience at Ohio State has been as an instructor of record prevent you from including important examples about yourself and about your experience in your portfolio. A third question that we often get is, am I restricted to talking about my teaching experiences at Ohio State? And the answer is no. Of course, it is an award for graduate teaching associates at Ohio State. So if all of the wonderful things you talk about doing as a teacher have never been completed at Ohio State, that is not going to be as convincing to a selection committee as someone who's done wonderful things for Ohio State. But that does not mean that you should not reference teaching experiences that you've had elsewhere for us to understand the complete portrait of you as a teacher. And this is particularly true if you came to Ohio State with teaching experience and you want to reference that and talk about how your time at Ohio State has further enriched that experience or given you a different perspective on teaching than you had prior to coming to Ohio State or what have you. Next question. Can an impressive portfolio compensate for ineffective teaching? So, this is the sort of question that we get from people who say, well, I'm a really good teacher, but I just don't represent myself that well, and I'm worried that somebody who's maybe got stronger writing skills than I have will come across as a more effective teacher than I will, and so I shouldn't even bother. Right? I shouldn't even bother applying because maybe it's that I'm not a native English speaker and just my English isn't going to be good enough to win, for example. And that's just not the case. It's not the case. The faculty members that read these applications are very sophisticated in understanding these sorts of things, and they absolutely are interested in really seeing the most innovative, most effective teachers, graduate student teachers that we have here at Ohio State, see them as the winners, right? So you cannot just write yourself into excellent teaching that you haven't actually performed within the limits of this competition. Another question that we often get is, won't all teaching portfolios look alike? And we'll get to that, but no, the answer is no, because everybody's teaching experience is very varied. The artifacts you can create, the experiences that you've had, even with other members in your own department, will be very particular to you and your experience. And in fact, the more particular you can make it, the more effective your application will be. Very general ones, very general applications, very general statements, very general portfolios are not particularly impressive or convincing to a committee. All right, and what components should we include? Should I include? Yes, that's exactly what we're going to do. We've started covering some of those already, and we'll keep talking about them in the videos that follow.